Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're popping the hood on the SASB standards for asset management and custody activities. We're going to see exactly how asset managers are required to turn these incredibly complex environmental, social, and governance roles, which we all know as ESG, into real-world financial action. If you've ever found yourself wondering how your wealth manager actually processes these massive global risks on a day-to-day basis, well, you're absolutely in the right place. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with Section 1, the new ESG mandate. Then we'll move right into incorporating ESG factors and forecasting future trends. After that, we shift into the action phase with the power of proxy voting, engaging with investees, and finally, the active ownership impact. But before we really get into the weeds here, let's ground ourselves in the core philosophy of this entire standard. Integrating environmental, social, and governance factors, it's not presented as some passing trend or a political stance. According to the standard itself, it is a fundamental fiduciary duty to protect portfolios. It's really all about using every piece of material information available to preserve long-term value. All right, let's jump in. Section 1, the new ESG mandate. Out of a whole variety of metrics, this explainer is going to be laser-focused on two specific qualitative discussion and analysis requirements. First up is metric 410A.2, and this requires firms to describe their exact approach to ESG research and oversight. The second is 410A.3, which demands total transparency on proxy voting and engagement policies. Together, these two metrics force asset managers to explain not just what assets they're buying, but exactly how they are managing them. Moving right along to Section 2, incorporating ESG factors. Let's dive into the first phase of the investment lifecycle. How do asset managers actually bake this vast array of data into their wealth management processes? Well, the standard requires a systematic approach. It explicitly defines ESG integration as the, quote, systematic and explicit inclusion of material factors. So this means firms can't just casually mention climate change or corporate governance in a shiny marketing brochure. No, they must explicitly detail how these factors influence their view on the time horizons of their investments, how they shift traditional economic conditions, and ultimately how they alter the risk and return profiles of a portfolio. And honestly, it gets incredibly specific when it comes to accountability. I mean, if you're trusting a firm with your hard-earned assets, you need to know who's actually steering the ship, right? Under this standard, firms have to disclose exactly who is responsible for that day-to-day ESG integration. What are the specific roles of the employees involved? Plus, if they happen to farm out their money to external fund managers, they have to lay out the exact criteria they use to assess the quality of those external managers' ESG incorporation. It is all about proving real oversight. Which brings us to Section 3, forecasting future trends. Moving past the daily oversight, we hit the critical forecasting stage. This is where managers have to model long-term systemic risks. To protect capital, asset managers absolutely must run future-looking scenarios. The SASB standards actually require them to explain how they model these upcoming global shifts, and more importantly, how those theoretical models impact their actual real-world investment strategies. For example, firms have to discuss how they conduct scenario analysis for massive disruptive trends. We're talking about things like climate change, natural resource constraints, shifting human capital risks, or sudden, crippling cybersecurity breaches. And they can't just stop there. They have to detail the application level. So, does a sudden cybersecurity risk model change their broad strategic asset allocation? Because it probably should. Does a climate scenario force them to actively reallocate assets between different geographical markets or specific industries? They must lay out this exact logic clearly for investors. Next up is Section 4, power of proxy voting. Now we are shifting gears. We're moving from the research input phase right into the action phase, how this data hits the road through proxy voting. This is a crucial pivot. We're moving from metric 410A.2, which is essentially how a firm passively monitors the market and digests its research, over to metric 410A.3. And this is where we get to see how a firm actively uses its voting power as a shareholder to actually influence the management of the companies it invests in. Under metric 410A, firms essentially have to pull back the curtain on their entire voting process. Do they just blindly follow corporate management recommendations, kind of a lazy default position? Or do they actually rely on independent, internal research to make their calls? They also have to explain exactly how they determine support for specific environmental or social proposals. And on top of that, they need to clarify how their approach to voting might shift depending on the specific global market or local regulations they're dealing with at the time. Let's look at Section 5, engaging with investees. Because, let's be real, voting at an annual general meeting is really only one tool in the toolkit. Sometimes asset managers need to have direct, private conversations with the companies they invest in. Firms must specify their engagement strategy here, distinguishing between two very different approaches. Are their dialogues proactive, meaning are they meant to ensure good governance and prevent environmental or social issues before they even occur? Or is their engagement primarily reactive, essentially showing up with a fire extinguisher for damage control after a company experiences a major controversy? Which brings up a really crucial point. What does an asset manager do when corporate management just refuses to listen? What happens when that polite behind closed doors dialogue completely breaks down? The standard brilliantly handles this by requiring firms to outline their exact escalation process. It's literally a ladder of action. It might start quietly, just expressing concerns directly to non-executive directors. But if that fails, they might escalate to making a collective public statement alongside other frustrated investors. From there, it gets significantly more aggressive, submitting formal shareholder resolutions, speaking out openly at general meetings, or even seeking governance improvements through legal arbitration. And the absolute final step on that ladder, exiting or explicitly threatening to entirely divest from the investment. Finally, Section 6, the active ownership impact. Let's see how all of this engagement feeds directly back into the broader investment strategy. Firms don't just engage in a vacuum for good PR. The standard asks them to prove their impact by disclosing exactly how the outcomes of these difficult conversations are passed back to the portfolio managers. How do they decide what information to pass on? And how do they monitor if that information was actually used to make an investment decision? They can even provide hard quantitative metrics here, like exactly how many in-person meetings they held and the number of dedicated staff they have working on proxy voting and engagement. Ultimately, these qualitative metrics force a level of transparency that goes way, way beyond a simple marketing pitch. It leaves us with a critical question to ask of anyone managing our wealth. Are they just sitting back and passively watching global risks unfold? Or are they stepping up, using their massive influence and acting as active owners to shape a more resilient portfolio? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.